Greetings from South Wales and welcome to what is part 8 of our series exploring the stories of Jesus on the road recorded in Mark's Gospel. My name is Sean and I'm God Squad's International President. Now we're going to start looking into the beginning of chapter 2 of Mark's Gospel, and word was getting about as Jesus was hitting the road. Interesting things were happening when he was in town, and the company he was keeping was causing quite a bit of a stir, to be honest, amongst the community there. Now let's remind ourselves why Mark wrote these stories down and who he was actually writing to. And he wrote them down to explain ultimately who Jesus was. And he wrote them under the influence as a result of listening to reflections of one of Jesus' key disciples called Simon Peter. Now, shortly after this, Simon Peter was executed by the Roman authorities under Emperor Nero, who was really starting to turn the heat up on all the Christians there in Rome. So Mark primarily wrote to encourage these brothers and sisters who were living under oppression in Rome in a certain amount of fear, and who quite naturally will have been asking, is this a price that's actually worth paying right now? So as the first recipients of this writing will have been squeezed into each other's homes, wondering what was going to happen next under the brutality of Nero, Mark chooses to include an account of another packed house. And it's what will be the first of 5 stories placed together in this next series of reflections, where Jesus experiences conflicts with Jewish authorities that will eventually lead to his own death. So we're going to look at Mark chapter 2 verses 1 to 12, and I'll read them for you. Let's say this: a few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he'd come home. And they gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. And some men came, bringing to him a paralysed man, carried by 4 of them. And since they couldn't get to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and then they lowered the mat the man was lying on. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralysed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fella talk like that? Surely he's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralysed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home. So he got up, he took his mat and he walked out in full view of them all. And this amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we've never seen anything like this. Now, this is a story I was very familiar with as a child, and it's one of those that features in most children's Bible story books. Jesus turns up, makes sick people better. Jesus is a good bloke. Now this one's particularly memorable because the paralysed guy's mates did really good by him. And we'd all like mates like this, and we'd all like to think we do this for our mates as well. But there's a whole lot more to this story than mateship and miracles. In part 7 we looked at Jesus' healing of a leper, a man who was socially excluded from society due to his particular disease. And Jesus was also now a marked man by the religious Puritans because he'd been hanging out with a dirty leper. That actually touched him as part of the healing process. Now this paralysed man was shut off from society in a different kind of way. He was reliant on others to get out and about. Now Jesus' reputation had gathered enough support and suspicion for people to crowd into a home in Capernaum where Jesus had set up his base of operations in Galilee. Remember too that Galilee itself was considered to be a marginal backwater by the religious elite further south near Jerusalem. Now the first point I want to look at in this story is, who were this crowd of people exactly? If we really wanted to dig into what these Bible narratives tell us, we need to get beyond the idea that it's all just black and white. And in this situation, a crowd is a crowd, right? It was a house full of people clamouring to hang on every word that Jesus said, there in the hope of seeing some kind of mysterious miracle show. The words we read in this passage find their origins in a language and culture a long way from where we are right now. Aramaic words and stories shared by word of mouth, eventually written in Greek, influenced by ancient Hebrew scriptures, and in a context of increasingly influenced Rome and Greek culture 2,000 years ago. And the word that's used for the crowd here, and 38 times in Mark's Gospel, is not a word that simply means a mass or a lot of people, like a whole crowd at a football match, for example. This word finds its roots in a phrase that had once meant the people of the land. Over the centuries of change in Hebrew history and times of exile and a return to their land, the phrase had also then come to mean the commoners left behind. And by the time of this story, it meant the lower class, the poor, the uneducated. And the Greek equivalent in this writing could also refer to the non-combat military personnel performing menial tasks. It certainly wouldn't have referred to the officers. So when we read the word crowd in Mark's Gospel, we need to be understanding the anonymous people, not the ruling class. So this becomes especially poignant as Mark is writing to a crowd of marginalised, persecuted brothers and sisters suffering at the hands of the ruling class in Rome. So here's Jesus, and he's attracting and choosing to associate and teach a bunch of marginal outcasts. It's the anonymous people that were flocking to him. Now, in God's Squad for decades, many of our members and friends and associates have worn a pin badge that simply says, Jesus Christ, friend of the outcast. And this simple phrase finds its home deeply embedded in stories like this as their example and mandate. Now, it's no wonder then that the teachers of the law, or the scribes as they were called, took some interest in what was going on here. These were serious blokes who knew their religious laws and culture like nobody else. And keeping company with the sick, with the poor, the possessed, this was not the norm for some would-be religious leader. These guys were hot on all this stuff. And they knew that you shouldn't be sharing with meals with these kind of people or travel with them. You should keep them at a distance. Don't be going near that crowd, is what they'd have been saying. Now, the second point is this. What was the conflict really all about between these teachers of the law or scribes and Jesus? Ultimately, they knew that only God could forgive sins. So when Jesus announced to the man, "Son, your sins are forgiven," this would have been such an insult to these law experts. Why? How can this mere man utter such blasphemous words? It was possibly the most disrespectful thing a man could say in their eyes. But it helps to understand some of the cultural context of that time. You see, if you were sick or you had some kind of disability, it was common for people to think it was because of a person's sin, something bad they'd done in their life. The sickness was some kind of punishment upon them. Now, my own degenerative health condition, Parkinson's, at that time would render me a hopeless outcast in that community, because surely I must have led some kind of debauched life to warrant such a decay in a particular part of my brain. And similarly, if you were born with a disability, there was an assumption that it was punishment for the sins of your parents or maybe your ancestors. So when this paralysed guy is brought in with his mates, as well as his own thoughts of, what have I done to deserve this in my life? Which, trust me, that is a question that anyone with a debilitating illness asks constantly. And the whole community would be asking this same question, especially the religious nitpickers who also assume this guy must have a shed full of dirt in his life somewhere that he most certainly needed forgiveness for. Now, I don't think for one moment that Jesus' act of offering forgiveness is a sign of his agreement and sharing its understanding of linking lack of physical wholeness and spiritual poverty. But what I do think it does is clearly demonstrates that Jesus had the ability and authority to release this man and all men from all that burdened him. Where he'd been denied full status in society, Jesus was now publicly restoring him. But the forgiveness that Jesus pronounced on this man wasn't the forgiveness of a single offence, but the announcing and declaration that a full pardon from divine judgment was now a real and living presence. As clear as the paralysed man could now stand up and walk among them, so he was also free from his spiritual paralysis. He was free indeed. And Mark brings this point of conflict into the story, knowing full well that it will be a conflict that would eventually see Jesus crucified, and it's a conflict that will become more and more apparent as we move through the story of Mark's Gospel. Now, the third point I want to make briefly is, what's all this Son of Man business? What does Jesus mean when he says the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins? Now, it's a phrase that features in all four Gospels and continues to be the subject of huge debate and discussion for many centuries and with many theologians, and I'm not going to pretend to try and cover everything in just a minute or two here. But it's a phrase that Jesus used of himself 14 times in Mark's Gospel, particularly with reference to his suffering, his death and his resurrection, and his authority and his eventual return. But at its most basic, it translates the human one. But it's also a phrase for a heavenly entity that features in a couple of Old Testament prophets. But put simply, plus the nature of this highly charged atmosphere in this story where the anonymous Jesus engages in conflicts with the religious elite, I think Jesus is inferring something like this. I want you to see that this mere man that you think you're looking at is more. Is so much more than a mere man. A man of flesh and blood who's called to and wrestle with suffering, the cost of redemption, the liberation of people from all that binds them. And as Luke records in his Gospel, the Son of Man who came to seek and to save the lost. The God-man in frailty of human flesh and bones that continues to issue an invitation of liberty, of freedom, of forgiveness, of being included when everyone else says you're excluded. In this story, Jesus turns the debt code on its head and makes everyone equal before God. Although the disciples that we'll start to read about next week are a tight-knit group, they form a wider community that embraces the outcast and the marginalised, which is a complete contrast to the religious order of the day, which found its identity in excluding people. So once again, we face some challenges, and these challenges can include things like what can people say of the church, of God Squad, of us, if we claim to follow Christ? Do they say, wow, we've never seen anything like this? Or are the conflicts we engage in as a result of the work of Christ in us, or are they as a result of our insistence on being right? And if we were squeezed into that room that day, what would we see? How would we respond? Or if we were squeezed into a room in Rome reading these words for the first time, paralysed by fear with Nero's men pacing outside, how would we feel and respond? And if we open our eyes to the world we live in now, where people are marginalised and held at arm's length for many reasons, real or perceived, and where authorities and the powerful treat some people more equally than others, and where collateral damage is measured in human lives, who would the crowds be that would be flocking to Jesus today? Would we welcome the anonymous people as Jesus would? Now, part 9 brings more conflict as Jesus chooses another unlikely disciple. So thanks for tuning in this time. I hope there's something of encouragement and constructive challenge in here. And if you're just joining us, you're just checking in on these series, then please check out the earlier parts, especially the introduction, which will really help shape everything that you can learn from this present series. So cheers, God bless, take care, and we'll see you next time.